within complexity science, there's a special subset of things that are called complex adaptive systems, which are what living systems are, right? Like, not only are they complex, somewhat unpredictable, but they adapt to circumstances as they evolve. And so the way I would describe it is, unlike a simple game where you learn the rules and then you just follow the rules and you get, so think of weight as an example. The most common way of thinking about it is calories in, calories out, which basically says, if I eat less calories, I'll lose weight. And if I continue to do that, I'll continue losing weight and I'll get to have any weight I want, right? So that simple game makes sense, right? It's intuitively obvious. It also doesn't work. Like, it kind of works until it doesn't.
Collective Insights is a voyage through topics and technologies revolutionizing human well-being. Groundbreaking approaches for a better world and a better life await you. Welcome to Collective Insights.
Hi, I'm Dr. Gregory Kelly. Before we get into this week's episode, I'm excited to share some information on a new product I helped formulate called Qualia Symbiotic. As a naturopathic physician, one of the most common concerns among my patients has always been gut and digestive health. In fact, recent survey data indicates approximately 40% of Americans experience digestive health discomfort on at least a monthly basis. But digestion is just one part of gut health. Did you know your gut also contains millions of neurons? It forms a two-way communication pathway with your brain called the gut-brain axis that affects your mood and brain performance. Your gut health is also crucial to immune health, optimal nutrient absorption, and even your aging process. In creating Qualia Symbiotic, I worked with the Neurohacker science team to factor in a far broader range of considerations than just digestion alone, to create an all-in-one formula supporting the full picture of gut health. The 28 gut health superfoods and ingredients in Qualia Symbiotic includes spore-form probiotics, psychobiotics that are ideal for supporting healthy brain performance, along with prebiotics, postbiotics, and fermented foods. And unlike many gut health products, Qualia Symbiotic is shelf-stable with no refrigeration needed. It's also non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, and FODMAP-friendly. Add 1 scoop a day in a glass of water for comprehensive gut health support without the hassle and effort of a complicated gut health regimen. Go to neurohacker.com/insights15 to try Qualia Symbiotic risk-free for 100 days and experience the difference that total gut health support can make. That's Qualia Symbiotic at neurohacker.com/insights15 to start supporting the full picture of gut health.
Welcome to Collective Insights. I got to say, I'm so excited for today's podcast. This is one that I wanted to record forever. As you guys have probably come to love Dr. Greg Kelly as a host, today we get to interview him and really talk about his book, Shape Shift. I've read it now a few times, and it is an incredible book because not only does it address a lot of the major concerns about weight gain and optimizing your shape, but it also kind of teaches you how to think about health in a more intelligent way. And he really goes to great lengths to explain complexity system science and how really to look at a piece of information, whether it's a study or whether it's some fact that you stumble upon or whether it's a piece of food, really look at it and think about it and kind of view it as information and how to process that information. He uses this beautiful Sherlock Holmes analogy throughout the book about how to interpret clues in your health. So if you haven't met him, which I'd be shocked if you hadn't, Dr. Greg Kelly, he's the Director of Product Development here at Neurohacker Collective. He's a naturopathic physician and author of our book topic today, Shape Shift. And we are delighted as well to have Dr. Nick Bitz. He's going to be helping and interviewing Dr. Greg. And Dr. Nick Bitz is a naturopathic physician that specializes in Ayurvedic medicine. He is the leading voice in the natural products industry and is currently the Senior Product Development here at Neurohacker Collective as well. So we're going to have a really fun conversation diving into a lot of different topics such as stress, sleep, weight gain, and cravings. And without further ado, Nick, why don't you kick it off with Dr. Greg?
This is going to be a fun one. So I'm happy to speak with Greg about this. This is long overdue. It's a fantastic book, Greg. So Shapeshift, the name of your book. Speak a little bit about that. Why did you write about shape rather than weight? And if you could give some definitions that I'm sure you'll be talking about throughout, shape intelligence, and really the idea around natural shape and why that's important and perhaps more important than weight.
Sure. So first, my interest in weight goes back to right out of college, going to the Navy, having gained a bunch of weight in college, and then fundamentally, doing healthier things. When I got into the Navy, it was in Coronado, so not too far from where Lauren and I currently live, and pretty effortlessly, slimmed down, gotten, I would say, fitness shape, right? I was leaner, stronger, healthier. But because that was the case, when I got to my first ship, the Navy in the mid to late 80s always had weight standards. And so I was the fit officer. So like, oh, in addition to your regular job, by the way, now you have to make sure all these people pass our standard. And so what was really apparent within, a couple cycles, it would be the same small subset of people that struggled to meet wage standards, would maybe make it for a day. They'd get their way in, they'd check the box, and then they'd be back there 6 months later struggling to make weight again. So it was a fairly fruitless collateral job for me, and it was discouraging for those people. So I learned pretty early on that it wasn't just the eat less and exercise more. That kind of works until it doesn't. And then for a variety of other reasons in practice, like weight was never far from my daily experience, at least with some subset of patients. And so at some point, I just got really frustrated with what I viewed as a lot of poor advice being given to people that really needed better advice, and decided I'd commit to it. And the reason, shape instead of weight is, I go into it quite a bit in different chapters in the book, but weights are really like a less accurate clue than shape. So like an analogy I give in the book is, think of like a block of stone that weighed, let's just say 10 pounds. And then, imagine if you had the statue of David by, was it Michelangelo or Raphael, whoever did it, and that happened to weigh 10 pounds. Like, we wouldn't confuse those two things, right? Like, one's clearly different than the other. Not the weight isn't the tell, it's the shape of the stone, right? So most people say, oh, I want to lose weight. Usually what they say is, I want to look more appealing, right? I want to be in better physical shape. I want to be like leaner here, maybe like have more weight somewhere else, right? So weight just isn't a great goal, like in simple terms. And then, this came up actually in the Stephan Guyenet podcast when I interviewed him on his book, Hungry Brain. He even mentioned, oh yeah, like body composition, those things would be great. We just don't have those. Like in big studies, measuring weight is easy. Measuring those other things is more complicated. We just don't have it. And it's a shame, because quite frequently in studies, weight will give like one indication of something. And if you had information about shape, so waist circumference, body composition, subcutaneous, visceral fat, all these like layers of nuance, you come away with a completely understanding of what just happened. So fundamentally, that's why shape instead of weight. It's really what people, if they knew the language, it's what they mostly would care about. And then shape intelligence is like, I would actually partition out that intelligence to multiple sub-intelligence, right? Like there's, like an intelligence that decides how much muscle we have and where it is, how much fat we have, where that is, how much bone we have and how resilient our bone is, right? Like there's all these sub-intelligences doing their best to adapt us to our circumstances and doing it in the way that they think is best, right? So Lauren mentioned the idea of complex adaptive systems, but that's a big part of the introduction. It's a model I try to introduce because what our body's invariably doing, we may not agree with, but we oftentimes won't like it. But my bias is our body's always doing its best with the resources it has and what it knows how to do to kind of match us to the environment.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, when I was reading the book, I was struck by the fact that there's a lot of overlays from the naturopathic philosophies, from the Ayurvedic philosophies, and how you framed it. I think you took a very scientific approach, which I really loved and appreciated. When you were talking about shape intelligence, I was really relating back to the naturopathic way of thinking about the vis. It's kind of this innate underlying intelligence that drives everything, and the body knows. And so if you push things out of balance, it will naturally want to go back into balance. And so that is that movement, that shape development that we acquire over time. And this idea of natural shape, I mean, we all have our natural innate shape. And that gets back to the Ayurvedic philosophy about body types. Your body, your mind, your constitution, they call it the dosha. So can you speak to that a little bit? Like, what is that idea about everybody has a natural shape that they need to honor, that they need to understand?
Yeah, I think there's like our current society tends to view what I would think of as a constitutionally leaner shape, right? But that, and especially for women, that's maybe shifted more for women over the last 100 years than for men. Like, even if you go back to Marilyn Monroe in the early 60s, she wouldn't match that, Instagram fitness model type of desired shape today. She was just like a more full-figured shape, right? But her proportions, I think, would still be viewed as, really attractive by most males today, right? Like, so that weight, that constitutional, are you on the lean side, the, more middle, or like thicker, stouter person? Like, some of those are under our genetics, some are because of learned things. But I've told Lauren this, like, I graduated high school, I weighed 110 pounds. Like, I was that cross-country-ish type of build. Not that I was a good runner, but I was just really that super hyper fidgety kid that just could eat forever and never put on any weight at that point in my life. And I wanted to, right? Like, I would see the back of comics, like the protein powder guy. Like, I want that. I want to be that guy, right? That's just not my constitution, right? I have friends that have done way less over their life in terms of lifting weights that have thicker muscles than I do. That's just not my constitution or genetics, right? But within whatever ours happens to be, we can do an immense amount to have a more desirable shape.
Yeah. And so getting into the book, and Lauren talked about this a little bit. So you do introduce two characters right at the open of the book, and you always have this dialogue at the opening of a chapter as well as at the end of a chapter. Who are these characters, and why did you introduce them into the book?
So the characters are called the halcyon investigator, that would be akin to Sherlock Holmes, and then the apprentice, right, which would be akin to Dr. Watson. And like Lauren, I love the Sherlock Holmes books. I've read them, several times in my life. And you see those archetypes still, right, in Dr. House, that TV show. He would be that Sherlock Holmes type. And you, as the audience, learn both from him, but also because of the Watson character, right? Who's more like us. Like, geez, I don't understand this, right? So each chapter invariably is introducing something either new or a new way of thinking about something in the book. And so decided to use those characters as a way to begin and end each chapter, with the apprentice character being more like the audience. Like, oh, well, what do you mean there's more to this story than I thought? And then the halcyon investigator, the Sherlock Holmes archetype, explaining it and leaving kind of the beginning in a way so it would make sense now as you move into that chapter. Oh, all right, I'm ready to understand calories maybe more than I did. Or, geez, I'd never thought about sleep being something that might cause me to get a lot fatter. But the apprentice hadn't either. And Sherlock Holmes is saying, you might want to look at this evidence and rethink that. And then each chapter then wraps up with a little dialogue between them too, with almost summarizing the learnings from that chapter. And then each chapter starts with a Sherlock Holmes quote, which then kind of thematically is, matched to whatever that content will be.
One of I think the common threads throughout the book is this idea about complex adaptive systems. It's something we talk about a lot at Neurohacker. I know you and I, being in charge of formulation, it's something that we discuss on a daily basis when we're talking about new product concepts. How did you kind of thread that throughout the book? How does that relate to body shape, body fat, muscle development, and such?
People think of science as if it's this one thing. Key point is science is a process, right? It's the scientific process. # science isn't a thing, right? Like, science is a process of trying to understand things. But ultimately, the goal of science is to make better predictions about what's going to happen next in a system. And so, starting in the 70s, there was this recognition that there's many types of real world systems that the established model of science. So think of science as, again, this process, but then there's theories within that. So Newtonian reductionist would be how we tend to refer to it in medicine, is a scientific model. And it's super useful for understanding something. Like, if you tried to figure out what a pool ball is going to do next on a pool table, Newtonian physics rocks, right? Like that's your best model to use. But if you were trying to understand what an atom is doing or electrons, like, not so great, right? You'd want to use a different scientific model called quantum theory or quantum physics. And so what emerged out of like the 70s and through the 80s was the science of complex systems, complexity science, which we talk a lot about at Neurohacker. And the best way for the audience to visualize it is that when a lot of things are interacting, the reductionist model is probably not going to be the best thing. It'll give you some information, but it's not going to do a great job at predicting. So like for our audience, just visualize it as, what you would see for a stock market over a year or 5 years or 10 years, right? It looks like kind of an up and down jiggly line, right? It's really like if all three of us, we said, okay, like predict what the stock market is going to be a year from now, our guesses are meaningless, right? Like, who knows? It's a complex system. If anyone knew that, they would do really well. All we can do is a best guess. So there's all kinds of real world systems that are more akin to the stock market or weather that are inherently uncertain. So just because of the complexity of their interactions. And then within complexity science, there's a special subset of things that are called complex adaptive systems, which are what living systems are, right? Like not only are they complex, somewhat unpredictable, but they adapt to circumstances as they evolve. And so the way I would describe it is, unlike a simple game where you learn the rules and then you just follow the rules and you get, so think of weight as an example. The most common way of thinking about it is calories in, calories out, which basically says, if I eat less calories, I'll lose weight. And if I continue to do that, I'll continue losing weight and I'll get to have any weight I want, right? So that's like a simple game. Makes sense, right? It's intuitively obvious. It also doesn't work. Like it kind of works until it doesn't, right? There's like one of the complexity systems things that I would love people to think is like, what happens and then what happens next? Because ultimately the what happens next, what you get to keep is what really matters. And what happens next in complex adaptive systems is often something counterintuitive, right? Like they change the rules of the game as the game's played. So what typically happens, someone goes on a diet, restricts calories, they lose weight for a while, they start to get hungrier and hungrier, they eventually start to think about food all the time, their metabolism slows, usually faster than based on the weight they've lost. And then they have to exert more and more willpower to continue to eat less. And as soon as they break the diet, the weight comes flying back on. So what happens next, and this has been studied many, many times, I highlight some in the book, is what's often called dieting-induced adiposity, or think of it as, like your diet made you fatter. So what invariably happens is people rebound to the same weight, but they're fatter at that weight than they were before the diet. And so that's, again, one of the reasons shape is a better clue than weight. Like weight will show that you didn't win, but shape will show that you actually lost by following that strategy.
Is this something that you were able to really download with your patients when you were in a clinical setting? Or, how does somebody understand the depths here? Because it's a lot, and you can learn a lot at the surface, but I think the value really comes in when you get into understanding complexity at its roots. And I think that's the focus of this book. Were you successful in a clinical setting at reducing weight for your patients?
So a lot of the book, so I was in practice up until about 2000 full-time, 2003 part-time, and wrote the book, over the, next 8 to 10 years. But a lot of it was based off that. My co-author, Mark Percival, was implementing a lot of the things at the time in his practice. That was kind of his role as the co-author, was to put some of my wacky ideas into practice. What I would say is most people, and I found this because I taught a course to doctors, chiropractors, naturopaths at one point, similar to the book, is their intuitions about what they should do and what would be maybe the best first thing are often wrong. Like as an example, there was someone I knew that him and I would have agreed a lot about what like food quality looks like, what quality foods, are, what more should be in the diet. But he was adamant that the path to getting, his clients to lose weight was, eating those things, but in really low amounts, basically making people, fundamentally starved, right? And I had a few of his patients that invariably contacted me because of someone else that were in tears because they were hungry all the time, feeling like failures. I mean, that's just what happens when body's most comfortable at currently. We get, I think what Stephan Guyenet referred to as like a starvation response. And when you see that show up, that means whatever strategies you're having that patient do aren't sustainable, right? They're going to fall off that. So rather than over focusing on how much you're eating, let's start off by how much you're sleeping. And if that improves, often how much you eat will reduce all on its own. Like your body won't feel the need to hang on to as much fat if you're well rested, as opposed to being chronically sleep deprived.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the sleep chapter. This chapter on sleep has really changed my life. And I mean, I'm going to read this little part from it, and I'd love to get to the sleep bus because that was incredible. But you say, and we blame the change in our shape on what we are eating and on our lack of willpower to resist fattening food. But in this case of insufficient sleep, the root problem is not eating more. Eating more is an effect caused by sleep quantity or quality problem. We are not getting fatter because we are eating more. We are eating more because our body is trying to get fatter. And while this is a subtle difference, it is a vitally important difference. Correcting this issue isn't a matter of eating less. It is a matter of sleeping more. And I don't think the sleep diet isn't that popular, but for me personally, just focusing on getting quality sleep every night really regulates my weight almost effortlessly. Like I almost say you can eat whatever you want as long as you get 2 hours of deep sleep a night. And of course, there's nuance to that, but I'd love for you to speak a bit more about your experience on this.
So I have firsthand experience with sleep deprivation, right? When I was a good chunk of my 5.5 years in the U.S. Navy was on ships. And a good chunk of that time was out at sea. And out at sea, you're doing rotating watches in addition to your job. So, I mean, I would say there was probably not a time in those 5.5 years I wasn't adding to my sleep debt each week, right? And I can remember at the time I was trying to be super meticulous about what I would eat. So I was putting a lot of willpower into choosing foods. And my simple heuristic then was trying to be low fat. So something, if there was a low fat version of something, I would always choose that. But I can remember times where I would, no joke, eat 100 fried shrimp. As soon as the wheels came off, they just came off, right? Because my body was trying to accumulate more fat and I was just resisting it all the time, right? And I was resisting it by controlling what I ate and then exercising a crazy amount. And that worked in a sense, right? I was able to moderate my weight, but never get it where I wanted. And it was a lot of work. And a lot of the reason that it required a lot of work was because I was, struggling against a big sleep debt at the time that was growing. And, so that's, that was my lived experience. And then, so it was always on my radar, sleep's important. Through naturopathic school, when I was in practice, working with doctors, it always shocked me, this was through the late 90s and early 2000s, that people were almost wearing being sleep deprived as a badge of honor. Look how cool I am. I only need 5 hours of sleep. And I'm like, people are all ridiculous. I need 8 and I'm going to get it. And so what at the time the book came out, there was a lot of research that was more what I would say correlational, right? Strong correlations between lack of sleep and getting weight, but not much in terms of what would be an intervention, meaning, okay, we have these people, let's make them sleep more than normal and see what happens to their shape. And now there's been some of that. I think at the time when I wrote my book, the only thing that existed like that was something that Glimmer magazine had done where they took 8 or 9 women and said, sleep for an hour more than you usually do a night and tell us what happens over the next month. And I think it was 8 of the 9 lost anywhere between 3 and 7 pounds and a couple inches off their waist, right? It was I bet if we studied this, we would see that writ large. And since then, there has been studies that have shown that.
So one of my most cherished bedtime moments is when the sleep bus comes and I run, get in my covers and jump on. Can you, for the audience, just walk them through this sleep bus and how it really works and how a lot of people fight with the timing of their sleep bus? And I didn't understand this until I did. And now, wow, it's been transformative.
Yeah. So, well, you would know this, Laura. I like to give analogies or storify things a little bit, especially that was valuable in practice, right? Trying to get something to sink in to someone I was working with. And we tend to think that we're in control of all these basic drives, like how much we weigh, how much we eat, how much we sleep. Like these are what I think of as permissive drives. Like they're regulated for us. And as long as we do an okay job, then our brain gives us the illusion that we're running the show. But it's running the show in the background. And one of the shows it runs is, how much sleep we need, but also the timing of when, what I refer to the sleep bus arrives. So we tend to have this sense like, oh, like I'm in charge of when I go to bed. If I want to stay up another half hour and finish this Netflix show or you name it, great, I'll just go to bed whenever I'm ready. But that's not how it works. What the way, to think of sleep or sleepiness, like that opportunity to effortlessly fall asleep pretty quickly is like a bus that pulls into a station. We can get on it or we can miss the bus. But if we miss the bus, we don't get to decide when the next bus is coming. It's either come whenever, and whenever is usually about an hour and a half later, somewhere, in that range. So the goal is to pay attention for when that sense of sleepiness is starting to build. That's the clue that the sleep bus is, getting ready to pull into the station, and then be ready to get on board when it's there, right? And if that happens, then most people will fairly effortlessly fall asleep, within 5 or 10 minutes. Now, Nick and I read a lot of studies on sleep ingredients, and often, like a vendor will say, oh, like, my ingredient rocks. Like in this study, instead of people, taking 40 minutes to fall asleep, it was 38. It's like, well, all those people are missing the sleep bus. This is a stupid ingredient, right? Like, let's just teach them to get on the sleep bus instead of trying to like change the schedule by a couple minutes when they've already missed it. So,
yeah, it's not okay. But that's something too that you've really taught me a lot, that like, it's not that big of a mystery when the sleep bus arrives. You should have about an hour. Like you should know when your bedtime is each day, give or take an hour. And I think a principle in your book is like honoring your sleep schedule and making time for your sleep in a way that prioritizes it, because you know that your body's going to steal sleep in some form, whether it's food, gaining weight, or just falling asleep in the middle of the day. I think you say a classic line in the book is something like, if your body needs sleep, it's going to take it wherever it can. And I think it, just to underscore the sleep bus concept, pick a time and it'll come every day around the same time, give or take. And just being aware of those clues. I can think of so many times in my life where I resisted against them. Like, oh, I'm getting sleepy, slap out of it. And then I'm like, uh-oh, it's bus time. I better get, I'm lagging. I haven't brushed my teeth. I haven't washed my face. I got to get on this bus. I don't want to sit around for 90 minutes waiting for the next one. I want to I want to get on. I want to go to Sleep Town.
And that sleepiness comes in waves. So it's not linear, right? Like it's more that complex adaptive system stock market thing, right? So if if sleepiness is building, so my normal bedtime's around 10. And so somewhere around then, it's like I feel sleepy and I go to sleep. If I fight that off, then you get kind of a second wind, right? Like you're more now awake and alert, and it's, like sleepiness doesn't build linearly. It kind of like a wave, ebbs and flows. And your point is super important because like sleep's crazy complicated. Our brain and body have to get all kinds of things lined up to have quality sleep. And the better it can predict in advance, like, oh, this is when those things need to be all queued up, then the better our quality of sleep.
Dr. Kelly, beyond even timing, I mean, what are some other foundational sleep tips, techniques, perhaps anything that's new? Is there anything that's emerged in the science as of late that is really interesting and that people can utilize to improve sleep?
Yeah, I think there's a ton. I mean, I've been using blue blockers well in advance of when I wrote my book 10 years ago. I think that's still among the best tips. I'm a big fan, again, what I think of almost as the Tai Chi way. Like a lot of sleep at night is dictated somewhat based off what we did in the morning and during the day, right? So like naturalistic lighting would be the way I would describe it. The better our light quality during the day and the darker it is at night, then our system just regulates better around sleep and sleep quality. So, we've done, I think, quite a bit on social media around sleep. And, a lot of the biohacks that you hear are super important. I think the one thing, like the sleep bus one is one that's just not as widely thought of, right? Like that we don't get to really control these things, like take advantage of it when our body's giving us a strong message.
Yeah, you have another quote in the book that says, if your body wants to sleep more, you should let it. Or maybe I'm stating it wrong.
Well, my belief would be something along the lines of, if you can sleep, you need sleep. Like sleep doesn't run in the black, it can only run in the red. So there's no such thing as like a sleep savings account where I'll sleep more today and save up for the future. It doesn't work like that. It can run in the red and it can be repaid in full. But, so fundamentally, if you can sleep, it's because your body needs sleep. So, and a common thing I used to see in practice is someone that was sleep deprived would all of a sudden, all right, like Dr. Rigg, I slept more on the weekend and like I felt way more tired than I normally do. And the way I interpret that is the system's like, oh, they're finally going to pay off some of this debt. So I'll increase sleepiness so that we can do that. So, that's often a clue that that person was really sleep deprived, is when you sleep more and you feel more tired. So, and we did, I think Thaddeus Owen and I, on his book recently on Collective Insights, we talked, much more about some of my experiments with intentionally sleeping for longer periods of time, the same with him, and how that shows up and what that can do for our health and metabolism. For me, my, like body temperature shifted a lot by intentionally sleeping more.
So I think we're about to leave the sleep town, but if I could summarize, you're saying if you were interested in optimizing your shape, the first clue that you would look for is your sleep hygiene, quality, and quantity, and that there's probably some clues there about weight gain and shape.
Yeah, like simple sense. Mammals, especially ones that live like hibernatory mammals, sleep and body fatness are commingled, right? Like they're integrated. And, as humans, we have some hibernatory genes. So I guess the way I would understand it is that shape intelligence, when it thinks, oh, Greg's been sleep deprived for quite a while, maybe at some point he's going to hibernate and sleep for a long period of time. I better build up some extra fat to be prepared for that. It's really that simple. Like sleep deprivation very specifically tends to accrue central body fat, right?
All right. We could talk about sleep all morning. I love it. Another area that really captured me in your book was this idea of stress as it relates to shape. I've heard you talk a lot about a game called The Last Straw or the Camel game. Can you tell us what that is, how that relates to shape, and perhaps give us some tips for reducing stress?
Yeah, so The Last Straw was a game that came out sometime in the mid-'60s. I got it for Christmas one year. Think of a plastic camel. On the back, there was something that hung over, so there was a bucket on each side, and then two teams. So there was a wheel you would spin, and if it landed on blue, you would have to put a blue straw into your basket. The other team would spin. Maybe theirs was red, so they would add a red straw. And at some point, one of the teams would add one of the straws in, and the back would collapse. And that was the last straw, right? Like something caused a catastrophic failure, fundamentally. Now, it's like I know in naturopathic medicine, we would commonly be taught to look for that last straw, right? Patients come in, their health collapsed, there was a catastrophic failure of sorts, and usually there's some big last straw event that you can pinpoint. Not always, but certainly commonly. And that's the cause. Oh, like, this happened, your health collapsed, which is somewhat true. But what the camel game would teach us is that way before that last straw, there was a whole bunch of other straws in that person's bucket, right? And so think of those straws as just sources of stress. And so the goal isn't to like carry enough stress in our bucket so that it's mostly full, because we never know when that last straw will come, how heavy it will be, you name it. So the real life camel game for me is like, let's see what straws are in this person's bucket. Let's figure out the ones that are most removable whether that's the heaviest, the easiest to move out of their current situation. And while we're at it, let's do things to make the camel's back stronger, more resilient, so it could carry more weight. And stress then becomes crazy important in terms of, again, shape. Maybe not as much for weight, but what happens with stress, primates in Africa, social stress. So Robert Sapolsky, his first book that was famous was Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, but that was a lot of his fieldwork was studying, I think it was baboons. And, the ones in the group that are under the most social stress have very specific patterns of body fat accumulation. It tends to be that central type of body fat. And so again, the way I would tend to think about it, stress tends to make us we need to be more substantial to withstand stress. And that often means accruing some degree of weight, and usually in places we don't want it. And so a big part of then improving shape, if that's the case, is dealing with stress, removing straws, healing old wounds. And in general, if someone's like my body is trying to defend a certain amount of weight, it's hard work to get it to weigh a lot more. But what I've seen sometimes in practice is someone between one visit and maybe another one a month, 2 months later, all of a sudden they put on 25 pounds, 30 pounds. I've seen even more, right? That's crazy hard to do unless something shifted in our system where that said, okay, I need more weight. I need to be more substantial for some reason. Maybe it was, an assault, trauma, some issue going on in their relationship, who knows? But what I saw is sometimes those kind of stressful things were things that could cause catastrophic gains in weight in really relatively brief periods of time.
Yeah, and a quote from your book, you stated, if we can do a better job managing stress, it's less likely that shape intelligence will feel the need to get involved. I love that. So how can somebody become more resilient? How can they improve their ability to adapt to stress? And how does cortisol fit into that too?
So cortisol will take first. That is one of what I think of as a chronic stress hormone. And what cortisol tends to do is very specifically cause certain patterns of body fat accumulation that are well known because of diseases like Cushing's disease or putting people on corticosteroid medications. But it tends to be central fat, sometimes that buffalo hump, you get fat in strange places when there's excessive amounts of cortisol, and again, cortisol is doing its best to match ourselves to, the stress, right? It's part of dealing with the stress. So I would say that stress is both. It's what happens to us and it's how we react. There will be some things, it doesn't matter how we react, they're going to be stressful, right? They're a straw. There's other things that the straw is largely because of how we reacted to something. And so I think there's what I would think of almost as rules of the game for the camel game. So a big part of the chapter is going into some of those different rules. But one, as an example, is stresses accumulate. If you're already stressed, a lot of the things we think of as biohacks that you hear talked about on their own might be super useful, but stacked into a plate that had a whole bunch of stress, that hormetic stressor, right? This low level thing that's supposed to make us tougher may actually be the last straw for us, right? So another heuristic that I think is super important is acclimation, right? So that's the idea, so an example is in the book is about, if you take rats and take them from normal environmental temperatures to, sub-zero or, freezing things, they'll succumb to that really quickly. But if you pre-adapt them, acclimate them gradually to it, they'll be able to survive in that cold longer. And that said, the other important, point from those studies is that their ability to survive in that cold environment eventually runs out as well. So, because we can adapt to something doesn't mean we should constantly do it. That it's taking resources, and that stressor will eventually catch up with us, right? So, in the book I mentioned stress leaves a scar. And I know we don't have them anymore, but I grew up with records. And, if you scratch a record, you can't get that scratch out, right? You can maybe still play the music, but there's going to be that scratch. And stress leaves a scar. So, because we are, tougher and, can put our body through crazy things doesn't necessarily mean it would be prudent to do that. So, and then the last thing would be something along the idea, Selye, who was one of the main stress researchers, he used the terms deviation as, his way of describing it. But fundamentally what he believed is most things, if we repetitively do them, will cause a stress response. It's just the system's way of evening things out. And, so as long as we introduce what he called deviation, but just think of it as variation, doing something different that will mitigate having that stress response. So, that is one of our tools always, right? Like, instead of sitting in front of your computer screen for 2 hours nonstop or on a Zoom call, for hour after hour, build in some times where you can go for a quick walk, outside, do a breathing exercise, you name it. But the other important thing from Selye's work is that was only a useful strategy before someone was exhausted. Once you're exhausted, deviation doesn't work anymore. It's doing a new thing. It's just now stress. You need rest and relaxation. So, that idea of picking when the most important thing might be doing nothing and just, recovering, as opposed to doing something that, adds like this nice healthy habit in because, I've heard this is a good thing. So pay attention to how exhausted we are. And when we're exhausted, the only priority is rest and recovery.
Yep, that's right. Man, stress management is so critically important. I think for the most part, I think most people are under-equipped. I know we talk about adaptogenic herbs a lot at Neurohacker. We use them a lot in formulations because they create that resilience that we're trying to give people, that buffer so that they can manage the effects of stress. And that certainly is my number one for most people almost across the board. Get on an adaptogen, whether it's ashwagandha, shatavari, ginseng, rhodiola, find the botanical that's right for your body type. Use it most days just to to arm yourself with more resilience over time.
Yeah, it's why we created qualia resilience, right? Like fundamentally, qualia resilience, simplest story is that's so that you can carry more straws, right? That's why we made it.
Yeah, well put. I love the way that you use analogies left and right. It's always fantastic. And Shapeshift, I mean, it has so many different aspects to it. It's very unique in a lot of ways. It really isn't a typical diet book, but there is a really good section on foods. And I like that you're using the ideas of heuristics, which are really these simple strategies that people can use when they think about food. If you have this option and this option, if you use a heuristic, you can determine which option is better for you at that moment. Michael Pollan, for me, had potentially one of the simplest heuristics, which came out some time ago. But he said, eat food, mostly plants, not too much. And I like that. It's just a very simple tool that you can come back to when you're having meals or you're making decisions to determine if something is healthy or not. And so I like that you've lined up, I believe it's 12 different heuristics in the book. I would love it if you could just speak to some of those and how does that guide how you look at food?
Yeah, so I think my first diet book I read was Eat to Win by Elson Haas, I believe, was the author. It was when I got out of college in '84, one of the gym rats, when I was saying, like, how do I get in better shape like you? He's like, read this book. This will teach you what to eat. And at the time, it was a high complex carbohydrate, low fat, was kind of the premise of the book. So like a baked potato would have been fine, rice would have been fine, pasta, things like that. And so my only heuristic I had when I food shopped at that point in my life was, like fat's not great, so let me find whatever option has less of it and I'll buy that. So, like skim milk as opposed to full fat milk, right? Easy. I'm not saying these were smart heuristics, but that was my heuristic, right? And so what I found over working with people many years is most people are running one or two heuristics. So like think of those as like rules of thumb in the background that are guiding the majority of the way that they choose foods. Maybe the current heuristic is someone, like on keto, their heuristic's different than that like complex carb heuristic, but they're running a fairly, simple heuristic, which is, is often something like avoid carbs, like, low net sugars, right? Someone on a different diet will be running a different heuristic. And so what I really tried to do in the book was not say, oh, like this is the best diet for weight loss. Because the best diet fundamentally is the one you're going to be able to sustain, right? So that the what happens next doesn't happen, right? Like your body has embraced the diet, it works for you. And that can be different for different people. But the way to think about food is going to be similar no matter what. So the second to last chapter, really goes into a lot of details of the things within the diet that change the set point, for the lack of a better way to say it. Because, and I still see this all the time, like, fights about, whether what's called KICO, like calories in, calories out is right or wrong. The insulin resistance model, where carbs are the villains, keto, like, all these things disagree with each other. But what I would say, after spending a lot of time reading research, the most fundamental thing to remember is what we eat dictates how much we eat. So yes, calories in matters, but depending what we eat, we'll spontaneously eat more or less calories. So focusing on controlling calories is the wrong emphasis point. Focusing on trying to understand why certain calories would make us eat more of them, like, is fruitful, right? So like, as an example, you could take the same amount of calories and puree it, like change the texture of it, and an animal will get fatter because the texture matters, right? Things that require more chewing, you and I would know this from Qualia Symbiotic and work we did on that. Like, things that require more chewing, more of the things in that are going to reach the gut microbiota where they get some lunch or dinner, right? They want that. So if they're not getting, what they need to eat, they're going to cause our brain to want more calories. So if we're having, say, as an example, a diet that's just not giving them much food, they're going to be nudging us to eat more of it so that they can get their share too. Where if there's more texture in the diet, more of it will survive, whether that's textures in meat, vegetables, fiber, you name it. So that chapter really is trying to educate people on these are the things that are most important in terms of what makes something quality food and what makes it work, with our, like, that shape intelligence to allow us to, improve our set point without it feeling like I have to exert a lot of willpower over what I eat.
And so just to go a little bit below the surface, one question for you. If we had to choose Coke or Diet Coke, what's your recommendation?
So I would do, personally, the Coke, 100%. And so again, this is actually in the subsequent chapter, the intuition one, I think, is where, like, the food intuition. But it's called flavor learning. But our system, again, like, just think of our system as being intelligent. It's trying to learn about everything that we do. And if, like, a certain taste is paired with certain nutrients, with certain macros, like, an amount of calories, it'll figure that out. It'll be able to predict it. So if the only thing I've ever drank that tastes like a Coke, or even in that zip code, right, always comes with calories from sugar, as soon as my taste buds taste Coke, there'll be part of me that's like, oh, like, I know what to do with this. Like, Coke's going to have this sweet taste is going to have these calories. I better rev up my metabolism to start to deal with that sugar. But if we now remove those calories, so now we're, like, doing artificial sweetener or stevia, then that same taste, our body's like, oh, if there's no caloric penalty to this taste, I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to do anything with metabolism. And so it's going to make a prediction on that. But now imagine it's learned that, oh, the taste of Coke never comes with calories. I don't have to worry about it. And now you have a Coke that does have, like, calories of sweetener. It's going to treat that as if it didn't have to worry about those calories. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it just speaks to the value of choosing complex, whole, real foods first, and if it's something you can recognize as a food, that's what you should choose. You shouldn't do these processed, refined ingredients that masquerade as foods, such as, fructose and other artificial flavors, sweeteners, and such. So,
yeah.
One of the things I loved on this list before we move on the decision tree, many of them have become popular, like choosing grass-fed over other options of meat, asking yourself how far away was this food created as a heuristic. And so if you're choosing between two things, to choose things more local from a nutrient. So all of that feels really good. But number 6, I just adored, and it is amazing. And it said, would your great-great-grandmother recognize every ingredient in the item? And so I've had a lot of fun at the supermarket, looking at labels and asking myself if my great-great-grandmother would recognize any of these ingredients. And it's led me to put down several options, because obviously we've introduced a lot of chemicals into our foods that didn't exist, but there is still like so many great options that our great grandmother would recognize, the coconuts and butter and real sugar and honey, like you spoke about. And you can actually eat really satiating and highly delicious food. So that one I've really held on to.
Yeah, so it's my bias anyways, is most of us don't have to be perfect with all our choices, but if we can make more ones of higher quality, that's better. And if we're going to make one that's somewhere slightly lower quality, find the best version of that one, right? So instead of, if I'm going to have potato chips, which is fairly rare, but I know you've seen me doing them at like lunch as a way to hack not being able or having to leave the booth for a while. I'm going to find simple recipe potato chips, right? Like potato, maybe olive oil and salt. Like that's good enough. I don't need one that's now got, 4 different flavorings and sugar added and other things. Like let's find the one that's highest, on that food quality hierarchy if we're going to eat it.
Yeah. And, I define health as freedom from limitations. And I find that if you're too rigid in what you're eating and your choices, and you're always aiming for a pristine diet, that's incredibly limiting, And so I always use the 80-20 rule where, 80% of the time I really focus on high quality foods. And then that gives me that freedom, that 20% of time where I can, play around. I can eat sweets, I can eat fast foods. I can do those things. But mostly my diet is high quality, plant-based, local foods.
Yeah. And I think I would tend to use the word or idea of relationship, right? So I think my experience is that most people's relationship with food, and I used to ask this question to all my naturopathic students when I was teaching nutrition. One of the thought experiments I would always say is, okay, imagine like at the front of the room here, we've got a couple different tables and, all kinds of food are laid out, right? Desserts, salads, a whole bunch of different entrees. Like, how would you know what to eat? And the most normal answer is, well, Dr. Greg, like I'm on keto, so I'm only allowed to have these things. So are they desserts keto or, like they would have what I would describe as almost a control type thing. Like I'm running this show. These are my rules. That's how I'm going to choose, like if they need that. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. Because what I would do is like walk back and forth a couple times, looking at all the options. And my body would say, oh, like I want this, this, and this. Like, please get me those, right? It would be obvious. They would just look more appealing in that moment, right? I would then trust my body that like, oh, you probably know more about what you need than my conscious mind. So I'm gonna go with you, right? And over the course of like in that one meal, maybe my food choices weren't awesome, right? They weren't like someone might look at him and like how's he staying thin, right? But over the course of time, that strategy tends to work really well if we've invested in building that trust and intuition. So I always cared when I was working with patients what they do, but their relationship to what they do.
You've talked so much about over the years with me about intuitive eating, which you just described so beautifully there. And I've always kind of laughed because I'm like, well, what if your intuition is to eat Doritos all the time? Like, what do you do? Or, that box of chocolate, that's my intuition. That's my intuitive eating. And I think a lot of us just now, and you've been preaching this to me over years and years about, the self-talk and the relationship with the body and how, and this book really continues to serve up of like, your body's trying to communicate with you. This weight gain is a communication clue. If you're stressed out and, feel like you're back is broken in the camel game, that's, clues that there's a cascade of things under that. But what's the clue on how to have like good intuitive eating? Like, how do you get there from wanting Doritos all the time?
Well, I would say we'll get to that second. But first is to have good intuitions of things, we have to have exposure. We have to build those, right? So persimmons were not something I ever had until about, say, like 12, 13 years ago here. And then at the farmers markets in San Diego, they show up reliably somewhere mid-end of September. And I really love the crunchy ones, not the ones that are more jelly-like. And the first time I had them, I bought a couple to try them out. And my body was like, we need more of these. So the next, next Sunday at the La Jolla Farmers Market, I bought like 10 pounds of them and I'd polished them off in like 3 days. Again, my body's like, no, I really want to learn this food, right? And so before that, I would have had, if I'd seen a persimmon on that table laid out of food, I wouldn't have any intuition to eat it. Like, why would I? I would never have learned about it. But now if I saw it, would be like, oh, I know persimmons. Like if my body was like, oh, the persimmons look great, then I trust it. Like, oh, this food. So we have to give our system a chance to learn. And most of us, like, an average person has learned about multiple flavors of Doritos, but maybe never a persimmon, right? So of course, they're not going to crave the persimmon. So, step one to build that intuition is try new things, but try them intensely and on their own. So it's a clear message. This is what this food is. And our system will learn it. It's like building a vocabulary, right? That's like one word at a time. And then, as that vocabulary expands, that system becomes wiser and wiser because it has more language to speak to us, right? So that would be one thing, right? Like out of the gate, if you haven't learned about much, your intuition's going to be a little bit wonky because your vocabulary is limited. Two is if, like as an example, if my body was craving, like Doritos probably wouldn't be it. Like the types of tortilla chips I would gravitate to would be like one of the locally made ones. But if for some reason that was what was appealing to me every time I opened my cupboard, then the first thing I'm going to think is, okay, is almost what we've talked about, right? Like, is sleep an issue, right? Or, is my body clock disrupted, or am I not moving enough? Or is there something else where my body's actually trying to gain weight because of something else that's amiss? And that would normally be the case. And like hydration is a big one. Like oftentimes we confuse a cry for starchy foods with fundamentally our cells need more hydration, and our cells can turn carbohydrates into energy, but a byproduct of that is water, right? So, sometimes it's as simple as, okay, I can have these Doritos if I want later, but in the meantime, let me have a big glass of water, maybe with some, like an electrolyte mix added into it, and then I'll recheck in an hour and see if I'm actually really still hungry for the Doritos, right? So I tend to, again, like that idea of Tai Chi, don't resist the craving, but, ask yourself about it, see if something else that's healthier will satisfy it. And if that's not the case, Doritos it is. So like, it wouldn't be for me, but like coffee ice cream, as an example, I probably 4 or 5 times a year would have coffee ice cream. I mean, maybe not even that much. But if I woke up tomorrow and was like checking in, like, oh, Greg's body, what do you really want today? And it was like, I would love some Haagen-Dazs coffee ice cream. Then for me, it's do not pass go to the market, get some coffee ice cream. Good on you. Now, if every day it was wanting coffee ice cream, then I would start to question, like, why, right? So anyways, just for the audience, intuitive eating, I think, is like valuable, but invest in it, right? There's tips on how to do that in the book. And trust our body. It's trying to learn about everything we eat, right? So with these new things that we try, if there's things in there that our cells, mitochondria, you name it, find super useful, they'll learn to like it. Even if our taste buds initially were like, yeah, no, I don't like this. So give it a chance. Like flavor learning is a thing, and our systems always, like that's one of the things, if not the most important take home here, is our body, brain, mind, however you want to describe it. Like its main thing it's always trying to do is learn about what we're doing now so we can better predict the future.
I love that. Yeah. For me, I mean, apple cider vinegar, perfect case in point. It's awful when you first try it, but the more you do it, the more you crave it over time. And that's a top shelf remedy I recommend for most patients, for most friends, most family members. So Greg, we've talked about sleep, we've talked about stress, we've done a little bit of a deep dive into diet. What else? What's new? What's emerged here in the last couple of years that's really piqued your interest that potentially you'll write about in the next version of Shapeshift?
I mean, I think when I wrote the book 10 years ago, there was some information on basically what I would call I always file things in a file, but it would be like how the gut microbiome influences shape. Like that has advanced so much in the 10 years since. So if you would say, oh, like if you wrote another version of Shapeshift, would there be any new chapters? Absolutely. There would be a chapter on the gut microbiome. And I think a lot of, what I touched on earlier, right? What we eat, and some of that is acting as energy for all these organisms that live in our gut microbiome. And they care about getting, what they need to live and survive and thrive just as much as you, Lauren, and I care about it, right? So making sure we're feeding them. And that's in large part why we created Qualia Symbiotic, to make that super easy for everyone, including, us, right? Because I want to make sure I'm feeding, as, a wise young lady has told me, like, I want to feed the animals in my zoo, right? So anyways, that would be the big thing. And then I think the other thing that I've seen is just a lot of the things like sleep. There's things that I was theorizing were probably true in the 10 years since. Now there's just more information that, this was not incorrect. This is actually right on the money. I think a lot of the things that at the time when I wrote the book, I would have loved to see more information to, see if what I was seeing in, practice and working with people, manifested in the real world. Since then, a lot of it has shown up in studies.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much packed in this book, which is great. And it's still incredibly timely. I think where people are starting to become more interested in weight, they've always been interested. But now with the rise of GLP-1 agonists and these various drugs, people are looking for quick solutions. But I think it's important to step back and really get into the psychology and understand what's actually at play, physiologically speaking, inside the body. And so that for me is really the value of Shapeshift. I think it's really getting into the underpinnings of weight loss, of shape, and health. I think it just looks at health in a very unique, different way. Dr. Kelly, thank you so much for being on. It's a true pleasure speaking with you, talking about your book. Excited to hear what's next from you. So thank you for being on today.
My pleasure.
To get your book, where should they go?
Right now, Amazon.com would be the only place it's located. So there's a Kindle version, and then there's hardbacks available. I'm not great at promoting, so I wrote it, it was like, good, on to the next thing. So I've never been as good at selling it. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit, because it was very much a labor of love.
Yeah, every page has changed my life, I can just say. So thank you for writing it for me personally. And I hope our listeners today have a chance to go and grab a copy and really enjoy just the way that he explains all these concepts. It's very unique and really shouldn't be missed. So thank you again, both Dr. Nick and Dr. Greg. And thank you all for listening in. Until we meet again.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease, or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional, herbal, or homeopathic supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guests' qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician. This podcast is owned by Neurohacker Collective.